A teenage shepherd walked onto the battlefield. The valley was silent. Two armies stood facing each other across a stretch of rocky ground. On one side stood the warriors of Israel, tired, nervous, gripping their weapons as the morning sun climbed into the sky. On the other side stood the army of the Philistines. And every single soldier knew the same terrifying truth. They were afraid. Because somewhere beyond the Philistine ranks, a giant was waiting. A warrior so massive, so terrifying, that the entire army of Israel refused to face him. Every day for 40 days, that giant stepped forward into the valley and shouted the same challenge. A challenge that shook the courage of an entire nation. His name was Goliath. And the man who would eventually stand against him was not a soldier. He was a shepherd boy. His name was David. What happened that day would become one of the most famous battles in history. The battlefield lay in a place called the Valley of Elah. It was a wide valley surrounded by steep hills, with a dry riverbed cutting through the middle. On one hill stood the army of Israel. On the opposite hill stood the army of the Philistines. The Philistines were a powerful enemy. They had superior weapons, skilled warriors, and years of experience in battle. The Israelites, led by their king Saul, had gathered to defend their land. But neither side had attacked. Instead, the two armies waited. Because the Philistines had a secret weapon. And every morning, that weapon stepped onto the battlefield. The ground trembled as the giant walked forward. He stood nearly 10 feet tall. His armor shimmered in the sunlight. A massive bronze helmet covered his head, and a coat of heavy armor protected his chest. The spear he carried looked more like a small tree trunk than a weapon. His shield-bearer walked ahead of him, struggling under the weight of the enormous shield. When the giant reached the center of the valley, he stopped. Then he shouted toward the army of Israel. His voice echoed across the hills. "Why have you come out to fight? Choose a man to come down and face me. If he defeats me, we will serve you. But if I defeat him, you will serve us." The challenge was simple. One man from each side would fight. The winner's army would claim victory. But no one moved. Because no one believed they could defeat the giant. Day after day, the giant returned. Morning and evening. Each time he shouted the same challenge. Each time the soldiers of Israel stood frozen in fear. Even King Saul, the tallest and strongest man in Israel, refused to face the giant. The giant mocked them. He laughed at them. And every day, the courage of Israel faded a little more. 40 days passed. 40 days of fear. 40 days of humiliation. Until one morning, someone new arrived at the camp. Far from the battlefield, in the hills of Bethlehem, a young shepherd watched over his father's sheep. His name was David. David was not a soldier. He had never fought in an army. Most days he spent his time alone in the fields, protecting sheep from predators and playing music on his harp. But David had something many warriors lacked. Faith. One morning, David's father called him. 3 of David's older brothers were serving in the army of Israel. His father wanted to know how they were doing. So he gave David supplies, bread, grain, and cheese, and told him to take them to the battlefield. David set out early the next morning. He had no idea that his journey would change history. When David reached the camp, he heard the sounds of an army preparing for battle. Men shouted orders. Armor clanged. Soldiers rushed to their positions. But as David spoke with the men, something strange happened. The giant appeared again. The massive figure walked into the valley and shouted his challenge. The soldiers around David suddenly grew quiet. Then they began to step backward. Fear spread through the ranks. David watched in confusion. "Who is this man?" he asked. "Why does no one fight him?" The soldiers explained. That is Goliath. He has challenged us for 40 days. No one can defeat him. But David saw something different. He didn't see an unbeatable warrior. He saw a man insulting the people of God. And David could not accept that. David began asking questions. What will be done for the man who defeats this giant? The soldiers explained that King Saul had promised great rewards. Wealth, honor, and even marriage into the king's family. But David wasn't thinking about rewards. He was thinking about courage. Eventually, word of David's questions reached King Saul. The young shepherd was brought before the king. Saul looked at him in disbelief. You cannot fight this man, Saul said. You are only a boy. He has been a warrior since his youth. But David answered calmly. I have fought lions and bears while protecting my father's sheep. When they attacked, I struck them down. The God who saved me from them will save me from this giant. Saul listened carefully. Finally, he nodded. Very well, the king said. Go, and may God be with you. Before David left, King Saul tried to help him. He gave David his own armor. Heavy bronze armor. A helmet. A sword. David put the armor on. But as soon as he tried to walk, he realized something. He couldn't move properly. The armor was too heavy. Too unfamiliar. So David removed it. Instead, he took something much simpler. His shepherd's staff. A sling. And 5 smooth stones from the riverbed. That was all. The soldiers watched in disbelief as the young shepherd walked toward the valley. Toward the giant. The giant stepped forward once again. But this time, someone was coming to meet him. At first, Goliath thought it must be a joke. The figure approaching him wasn't a soldier. It was a boy. A shepherd carrying a sling. The giant began to laugh. Am I a dog, he roared, that you come to me with sticks? He cursed David and shouted threats. But David did not run. He stood firm. Then he spoke words that would echo through history. You come against me with sword and spear. But I come against you in the name of the Lord. This day the world will know that the battle belongs to God. The valley fell silent. 2 figures stood facing each other. A giant warrior. And a shepherd boy. Then suddenly, they began to move. For a moment, the entire valley seemed to stop breathing. 2 figures stood facing each other in the dusty sunlight. On one side towered Goliath, a massive warrior covered in bronze armor, his spear gleaming like a bolt of lightning. On the other side stood a young shepherd. David. No armor. No sword. Just a sling, and a few stones. The soldiers of Israel watched from the hillside in disbelief. The Philistine army laughed loudly. They thought the battle was already decided. But David didn't hesitate. He moved forward quickly across the valley floor. The giant sneered as the young boy approached. You dare face me? Goliath roared. His voice thundered across the valley like a storm. I will feed your body to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. The Philistine soldiers shouted with laughter. But David answered with calm confidence. You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, David called out. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel whom you have defied. David's voice grew stronger. Today the Lord will deliver you into my hands. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Silence fell over the valley. Then suddenly, the giant began to move. With a furious roar, Goliath stepped forward. The ground shook beneath his heavy armor as he advanced toward the shepherd boy. Each step was like thunder. His enormous spear pointed forward. The sun flashed against the bronze plates of his armor. Many soldiers turned away. They couldn't bear to watch what they believed would be the death of the young boy. But David did something unexpected. He didn't retreat. He ran. The young shepherd sprinted across the valley toward the giant. Dust kicked up beneath his feet as he moved with speed and determination. As he ran, David reached into the pouch at his side. His fingers wrapped around one of the smooth stones he had gathered from the riverbed. He placed the stone into his sling. Then he began to swing it. Round and round. Faster and faster. The leather cords whistled through the air. The giant kept charging forward. He barely even noticed what David was doing. To Goliath, the shepherd boy was nothing. Just another victim. But David had spent years practicing with that sling while protecting sheep from predators. He knew exactly how to use it. The moment had come. The sling spun faster and faster. The sound cut through the air like a sharp whistle. Then in one swift motion, David released the stone. The small rock shot forward with incredible speed. Across the valley it flew. Straight toward the giant. There was no time to react. No time to raise a shield. The stone struck Goliath directly in the forehead. The crack echoed across the valley. The giant's head snapped backward. For a brief moment, the enormous warrior stood perfectly still. Then something unbelievable happened. The giant staggered. His massive body swayed. And slowly, the mighty warrior began to fall. Down he went. The ground shook as his armored body slammed into the earth. The giant who had terrified an entire army lay face down in the dust. Dead silent. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire battlefield stared in disbelief. The shepherd boy walked slowly toward the fallen giant. The Philistine soldiers watched in stunned silence. So did the army of Israel. David stood over the enormous body. Then he did something no one expected. David picked up the giant's own sword. The weapon was massive, far larger than anything David had ever carried. With great effort, he lifted it high. And with one powerful strike, David defeated the giant completely. The champion of the Philistines was gone. The valley was silent for a moment longer. Then the realization began to spread. The impossible had happened. The giant had been defeated. The Philistine soldiers stared in shock. Their unbeatable warrior had fallen. The man who had terrified the armies of Israel for 40 days was gone. Fear began spreading through the Philistine ranks. At first it was only whispers. Then confusion. Then panic. The soldiers began backing away. Across the valley, the army of Israel suddenly erupted with shouts of victory. The men who had been frozen with fear only moments earlier now roared with courage. They had seen what had happened. God had delivered them. King Saul shouted orders. Attack! The soldiers of Israel charged down the hill with renewed strength. Meanwhile the Philistine army began to collapse into chaos. Panic swept through their ranks. If their champion could be defeated, then they could be defeated too. Suddenly the entire Philistine army turned and ran. The soldiers of Israel pursued them across the valley. The battlefield that had once been filled with fear now thundered with victory. Warriors chased the fleeing Philistines across the hills and toward their cities. The enemy army that had once threatened Israel was now running for their lives. The victory was complete. But back on the battlefield, one figure remained. The young shepherd boy who had faced a giant. The boy who had stepped forward when no one else would. The boy who had trusted in God when an entire army had lost its courage. His name was David. And from that day forward, Everyone in Israel would remember his name. Because on that day in the Valley of Elah, a shepherd defeated a giant.